I want you to picture something. You're 65 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office 3 weeks after burying your own mother, and your younger brother, a man you cared for right alongside your mother for over a decade in the same house, looks directly at you and says, in front of the attorney, I just think we need to make sure Diane didn't help herself to anything extra while she had mom's checkbook all those years. And you sit there having given up 12 years of your own working life to keep your mother fed, bathed, and safe in her own home, being accused calmly and matter of factly of stealing from the very woman you sacrificed everything to care for. My name is Diane Porter. I'm 66 years old now, and for 12 years I was the primary caregiver for my mother, Eleanor, after a severe stroke left her unable to safely live alone. I gave up my career, restructured my entire life around her needs, while my brother Gary and my sister Patricia, both living within a reasonable driving distance, visited occasionally and contributed financially in ways that, I want to be honest, never came close to matching what I gave in time, energy, and lost income across those 12 years. When my mother finally passed away and her will divided everything equally 3 ways, exactly the way it had been written decades earlier before any of us knew what caregiving would actually require, Gary's suggestion that I might have improperly benefited from managing her finances broke something in our family that has never fully healed. I want to tell you honestly what those 12 years actually cost me, what that accusation did to whatever remained of my relationship with my siblings, and how eventually I rebuilt an entire life for myself on an island called Boracay in the Philippines, a place that gave me back something I didn't realize I had lost somewhere across those 12 exhausting, loving, ultimately unrewarded years. I need to back up though, because I don't think any of this makes sense without understanding exactly what those 12 years actually involved and exactly how much of myself I poured into them. I was 51 years old when my mother had her stroke, a severe one that left her right side significantly weakened and her speech considerably affected, though her mind, thankfully, remained largely sharp throughout the following decade. I was working as a marketing director at a mid-sized firm outside Portland, Oregon, a career I had built over nearly 2 decades, married to my husband Frank, our own 2 children already grown and out of the house by that point. My mother had lived alone since my father's death 8 years earlier, in a house about 20 minutes from mine, while Gary lived nearly 3 hours away in Bend. And Patricia had settled even further in California, visiting only a handful of times each year. I remember the specific phone call from the hospital, a Tuesday afternoon, a neighbor who had found my mother collapsed in her own kitchen and called an ambulance before anyone in the family even knew something had happened. I drove to that hospital in a state of controlled panic I still remember vividly. And I remember the neurologist's careful, measured explanation of exactly what a stroke of that severity would likely mean for her remaining independence, language I understood intellectually in that moment, but would not fully grasp the practical weight of until considerably later, once the actual daily reality of it settled in around me. The decision to become my mother's primary caregiver happened, in truth, less through any formal family discussion and more through simple geographic and practical inevitability. I was closest. I had, at the time, the most flexible professional situation since my firm allowed a reduced schedule that Gary's construction business and Patricia's own demanding career could not similarly accommodate. I want to be honest that I did not resent this arrangement initially, believing, as the oldest child, that caring for our mother in her most vulnerable years was simply the right thing to do, an attitude I maintained genuinely and without complaint for considerably longer than I probably should have. The first 2 years involved daily visits to her own house, managing medications, physical therapy appointments, the endless paperwork of medical insurance and home health aides. I remember those early months as a strange combination of crisis management and gradual adjustment, learning an entirely new vocabulary of rehabilitation milestones, insurance authorization codes, and the specific exhaustion of driving back and forth between my own household and hers multiple times daily, on top of maintaining whatever remained of my professional responsibilities during that same period. By the third year, her mobility had declined enough that I moved her into my own home entirely, converting our downstairs den into a bedroom, restructuring my entire household around her needs in a way that eventually required me to leave my career altogether, 4 years into her care, once the demands had grown too significant to manage alongside full-time work. I want to be honest that leaving that career, one I had built with genuine pride over nearly 2 decades, represented its own significant loss, one I rarely discussed openly with anyone, including Frank, because it felt at the time almost shameful to grieve a career while my own mother was navigating something considerably more serious than professional disappointment. I want to be honest about what those years actually look like day to day, because I think the specific texture of long-term caregiving deserves to be understood clearly rather than simply summarized. Mornings began with helping her bathe and dress, a process that, in the later years, took the better part of an hour, given her limited mobility. Medications had to be tracked meticulously. 7 different prescriptions by the final years, each with its own schedule and specific dietary requirements. Physical therapy exercises, which I learned to administer myself after our insurance coverage for professional sessions grew limited, required patience I did not always genuinely feel, but tried, consistently, to project regardless. Evenings brought their own particular rhythm, helping her into bed, adjusting pillows to accommodate the specific way her weakened side needed support to sleep comfortably, reading to her some nights when her own eyesight grew too tired for the large print novels she still, remarkably, worked through at a steady pace throughout most of that decade. I learned over those years an entirely new vocabulary, terms like transfer techniques and pressure sore prevention, alongside a specific hard-won patience for the particular slowness that caring for an aging body actually requires. Patience that, I came to understand only much later, none of my own siblings had ever needed to develop themselves. Gary visited roughly once every 6 weeks, staying a single afternoon each time, bringing groceries or occasionally handling a specific repair around my house that my mother's care required. He was not, I want to be fair, entirely absent or uncaring, but his visits existed within a fundamentally different category of involvement than the daily, unglamorous work of actual caregiving, the kind that doesn't stop for holidays, illness of your own, or simple exhaustion. Patricia visited perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, hauling more regularly than Gary did, genuinely warm during those calls, but living far enough away that any meaningful hands-on contribution remained, by simple geography, essentially impossible. I remember one particular Christmas, roughly 5 years into my mother's care, when Gary arrived for the holiday, visibly proud of a thoughtful gift he'd chosen for her, a warm blanket she genuinely loved, and I remember feeling in that exact moment a complicated mixture of gratitude for his gesture and a quieter, harder to articulate resentment that he could arrive, deliver a single thoughtful afternoon, and depart again, while I would spend that same holiday managing her medications, her mobility, the particular exhaustion of hosting an entire family gathering around a woman who required near constant attention throughout. I did not say any of this aloud that Christmas, or for years afterward, believing, as I had been raised to believe, that voicing such resentment would somehow diminish the genuine love underneath my own caregiving. I want to describe one particular period, roughly 7 years into my mother's care, because I think it captures something the general exhaustion doesn't fully explain. My own husband, Frank, was diagnosed with a moderate heart condition that same year, requiring his own set of appointments and lifestyle adjustments. And I found myself for several months managing 2 separate sets of medical needs simultaneously, while also attempting to maintain some semblance of connection with my own grown children, who had, understandably, built their own busy adult lives elsewhere. I remember one particular evening, sitting on my own bathroom floor at nearly midnight, simply crying from sheer exhaustion, having just finished helping my mother through a difficult night, and knowing Frank's own appointment awaited early the following morning. Neither Gary nor Patricia, I want to be honest, ever fully understood the accumulated weight of that specific kind of exhaustion, the sort that doesn't arrive through any single dramatic crisis, but through the relentless compounding accumulation of 1,000 ordinary difficult days strung together across more than a decade. My mother's finances during those 12 years fell naturally under my management, since I was the one handling her medical bills, her modest pension income, the household expenses her care required. I maintained meticulous records throughout receipts, a dedicated account separate from my own finances, precisely because some part of me, even then, sensed that eventually questions might arise about exactly how her money had been spent. I want to be honest that this careful record keeping in the end proved to be one of the wisest decisions I made across that entire period, though at the time I maintained it simply out of an instinct toward basic responsibility rather than any specific anticipation of what would eventually happen. My mother passed away peacefully in her sleep in the bedroom I had converted for her 12 years earlier at the age of 89. I want to be honest that the grief of losing her was, in its own particular way, complicated by an emotion I hadn't fully anticipated, a kind of exhausted relief that sat uncomfortably alongside genuine sorrow, the particular guilt of feeling, even briefly, that a chapter demanding everything I had to give had finally, mercifully concluded. I remember the specific disorientation of the weeks immediately following her death, waking at the exact hour I had woken every single morning for 12 years to check on her, before remembering each time that there was no longer any reason to. I found myself more than once during that period standing in the doorway of what had been her bedroom, now empty, uncertain what to do with a room that had defined the entire architecture of my daily life for over a decade. Frank gently suggested we wait several months before deciding what to do with that space at all, sensing, correctly, that I needed time to simply exist alongside the absence before making any practical decisions about it. Gary and Patricia both attended the funeral, of course, and I remember Gary delivering a genuinely moving eulogy, describing our mother's resilience and warmth in language that struck me, even through my own grief, as somewhat disconnected from the daily reality of her final decade. A reality he had witnessed only in occasional 6-week increments, rather than the accumulated granular truth of it that I alone had lived inside. I did not begrudge him that eulogy at the time. I understood that grief expresses itself differently depending on the specific shape of a person's relationship to the deceased, and Gary's grief, however genuine, was simply built from a different, more distant set of memories than my own. The will itself, drafted decades earlier before any of us could have anticipated what her eventual care would actually require, divided her modest estate, primarily the value of her original house, which we had rented out during her years living with me, equally three ways among Gary, Patricia, and myself. I had genuinely expected this outcome and had never, throughout those 12 years, assumed or requested that my caregiving would somehow entitle me to a larger share. What I had not anticipated, and what ultimately proved considerably more painful than the equal division itself, was the meeting in our family attorney's office 3 weeks after the funeral, when Gary, reviewing the estate's financial records alongside the will, made the comment I described at the very beginning of this story. I want to describe exactly how that moment unfolded because I think the specific mechanics of it matter to understanding how deeply it wounded me. Gary had noticed, reviewing 12 years of financial records, several withdrawals I had made from our mother's account for what he considered insufficiently documented purposes, despite my having maintained receipts for nearly every single expense across that entire period. Rather than simply asking me directly to clarify those specific transactions, he raised the question in front of our family attorney, framing it as a general concern about financial oversight rather than a private conversation between siblings who had ostensibly spent over a decade as partners in caring for the same aging parent. I want to be honest about how I responded in that exact moment because I do not believe I handled it with particular grace, though I also do not believe grace was genuinely owed given the circumstances. I produced, on the spot, the meticulous records I had maintained throughout 12 years of receipts organized by month, demonstrating clearly that every single withdrawal corresponded to a legitimate expense related directly to our mother's care. The attorney reviewed them, confirmed their thoroughness, and the specific accusation was, in the most literal sense, resolved within that same meeting. But something considerably larger than that specific financial question had already been damaged. The basic assumption, which I had held without question for over a decade, that my own siblings trusted me implicitly with the responsibility I had shouldered almost entirely alone. Patricia, to her credit, apologized on Gary's behalf almost immediately, visibly uncomfortable with how the meeting had unfolded, and privately told me afterward that she believed Gary's comment stemmed from his own guilt about how little he had actually contributed over those 12 years, projected outward as suspicion rather than acknowledged honestly as his own shortcoming. I appreciated her attempt at explanation, even as it did little to actually repair what had been damaged in that attorney's office. I want to describe the months that followed honestly, because I think they represent the actual hardest part of this entire story, harder in some ways than the 12 years of exhausting caregiving that preceded them. The equal division of the estate itself I could accept and genuinely had accepted long before my mother's actual death. What proved considerably harder to accept was the specific public suggestion that 12 years of sacrifice had somehow made me suspect rather than deserving of basic trust, a suggestion that recontextualized painfully an entire decade of my own life. I stopped attending regular family gatherings with Gary, specifically over the following year, our contact narrowing to the occasional obligatory holiday text message rather than anything resembling genuine relationship. Patricia and I remained closer, though even that relationship carried a new, careful quality it hadn't held before, both of us aware, without ever fully discussing it directly, of exactly how thoroughly that single attorney's office meeting had reshaped our entire family's dynamic. I want to describe one particular family gathering during that difficult year, my youngest granddaughter's christening, which both Gary and I attended out of obligation to Patricia's side of the family, rather than any genuine desire to be in the same room together. We spoke perhaps a dozen words to each other across the entire afternoon, both of us performing a careful, brittle politeness for the benefit of relatives who had no idea what had actually transpired in that attorney's office months earlier. I remember driving home that evening thinking that I had spent 12 years learning to manage nearly impossible physical and emotional demands with genuine grace, and yet I had no idea, none whatsoever, how to manage the considerably simpler task of being in the same room as a brother who had questioned my basic honesty. I want to be honest that Frank, my husband, watching me navigate this particular aftermath, eventually suggested something that initially struck me as almost absurd, given everything we had already built together in Portland. About 8 months after my mother's death, sitting on our own back porch on an ordinary evening, he mentioned almost offhandedly that perhaps we should consider an entirely different kind of retirement than the one we had always vaguely assumed we would eventually have in Oregon, somewhere that offered a genuinely fresh start rather than continued, unavoidable proximity to family relationships that had been permanently altered by everything that had happened. Frank had, in fact, been quietly researching retirement destinations for several months by that point, partly motivated by his own heart condition and a doctor's suggestion that a warmer, less physically demanding climate might genuinely benefit his long-term health. He showed me that same evening several videos of American retirees living on an island called Boracay in the Philippines, known globally, he explained, for some of the most beautiful beaches in the entire world, alongside a surprisingly manageable cost of living for retirees on a fixed income. I want to be honest that my initial reaction was one of considerable hesitation, uncertain whether I possessed the emotional resilience at 65 years old, freshly wounded by my own brother's accusation, to build an entirely new life somewhere so unfamiliar, so soon after 12 years that had already demanded nearly everything I had to give. But the idea, once Frank had planted it, did not fully leave either of us. The way ideas sometimes take root, specifically in the moments when you are most desperate for any path forward that doesn't involve continuing to live inside a landscape permanently altered by betrayal. We began researching together, quietly, over the following months, the retirement visa available to foreigners over 50, the actual cost of living, the specific logistics of relocating somewhere so completely different from anything either of us had previously considered. After nearly 4 months of careful research, we decided on a 2-week trip, partly a genuine scouting mission, and partly, I suspect for both of us, a chance to simply breathe somewhere entirely removed from Oregon's particular geography of family tension. We flew to Manila first, then took a short additional flight and boat transfer to reach Boracay itself, and I want to describe honestly what greeted us upon arrival, because I think it matters to understanding why this particular place, of all the options we'd researched, ultimately won us over so completely. The water itself, when we first walked onto White Beach, the island's most famous stretch of coastline, was a shade of turquoise so vivid it genuinely looked artificially enhanced. The sand beneath our feet fine and white in a way neither Frank nor I had experienced at any beach either of us had previously visited across our entire lives. I remember standing there that first afternoon, shoes in hand, watching Frank wade into the water up to his knees with an expression on his face I hadn't seen since long before his diagnosis. Something close to boyish delight that seemed almost incongruous on a 68-year-old man with a heart condition. He turned back toward me and said simply, "I haven't thought about Gary once since we landed." And I realized, hearing him say it aloud, that neither had I, for the first time in 8 months that my own mind hadn't circled back at some point during the day to that attorney's office and everything it had cost me. That evening, walking along the same stretch of beach as the sun set, we passed dozens of small sailboats called Paraws returning to shore, their colorful sails catching the last of the light, and vendors setting up along the sand selling grilled seafood and fresh fruit. The whole scene felt to both of us less like a tourist destination and more like an entire community winding down together at the end of an ordinary day, an atmosphere considerably different from the more manicured commercial beach resorts either of us had experienced on previous vacations back in the States. We stayed in a modest resort for those 2 weeks, and I found myself within just the first few days experiencing something I hadn't felt in longer than I could accurately measure, genuine, uncomplicated relaxation, entirely unburdened by medication schedules, physical therapy appointments, or the specific accumulated exhaustion of 12 years of caregiving that had only recently concluded. Frank, similarly, seemed to physically ease in a way I hadn't witnessed in him since long before his own diagnosis, walking the beach each morning with a lightness that suggested the warmer climate was already doing exactly what his doctor had hoped it might. I remember in particular our third morning there, sitting together on the sand watching a group of local fishermen bring in their morning catch. An entirely ordinary scene that nonetheless struck me with unexpected emotional force. The simple, uncomplicated rhythm of people going about an ordinary working day, nothing demanding my attention, nothing requiring me to manage anyone else's needs. I found myself crying, briefly, and without any particular trigger beyond the sheer novelty of that unstructured piece. And Frank, without needing an explanation, simply put his arm around me and let me sit with it. We met on our 4th day there, a small group of American and Australian retirees who gathered most evenings at a beachfront restaurant, several of whom had lived on the island for years already. And one woman, when I mentioned carefully some of what had brought us to consider this particular move, listened with a genuine, unhurried attentiveness that struck me as different from the careful, distracted sympathy I had grown accustomed to from friends back in Portland who, however well-meaning, had their own busy lives pulling their attention elsewhere. Family wounds like that, she told me, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is simply put an ocean between you and the specific rooms where it happened. We toured a modest hospital on the neighboring mainland during that visit, a consideration that mattered considerably given Frank's own heart condition, and found the costs, when the administrator walked us through the general fee structure, considerably lower than anything comparable back in Oregon, alongside cardiac care specialists whose credentials, once we researched them further, proved genuinely reputable by international standards. By the end of that 2-week trip, both Frank and I knew, in the particular quiet way you know something before you've fully admitted it to yourselves in words, that we wanted to rebuild whatever remained of our retirement somewhere entirely removed from the specific geography of everything that had happened with Gary. We flew home to Portland and spent nearly 5 months finalizing the practical details, the visa paperwork, the sale of our house, a process made considerably easier, if I'm honest, by the fact that neither of us felt any particular reluctance about leaving behind a landscape so thoroughly reshaped by that single meeting in our family attorney's office. I told both Gary and Patricia about our decision separately. Patricia was warmly supportive, though genuinely sad about the physical distance the move would create between us, a sadness I understood and shared, even as I remained certain the decision itself was correct. Gary's reaction when I finally told him carried an undertone I found difficult to fully interpret, something between genuine surprise and, I suspected, an unspoken recognition of his own role in making Oregon considerably less comfortable for me to continue living in. He did not apologize directly during that conversation, though he did say, somewhat haltingly, that he hoped I would find some peace there, language that felt at the time like the closest he was likely to come to acknowledging what his accusation had actually cost our relationship. Packing up our own house of nearly 3 decades proved its own particular emotional undertaking, separate entirely from the grief and complications surrounding my mother's estate. Frank and I sorted through decades of accumulated belongings together, deciding what to keep, what to sell, what to pass along to our own grown children. A process made considerably gentler by the fact that we were making these decisions as partners, rather than either of us navigating it entirely alone. I kept a small box of my mother's own belongings, a few pieces of jewelry, photographs from her own younger years before any of us were born, unwilling to part with the physical remnants of a relationship that, whatever complications had followed her death, had genuinely defined the greater portion of my own adult life. I asked him directly during that same call whether he understood that his comment in the attorney's office was the actual reason we were leaving, rather than simply a general desire for a change of scenery in retirement. There was a long pause before he answered, and when he finally spoke, it was to say that he hadn't meant it the way it came out, language I recognized immediately as an explanation rather than an actual apology, a distinction I had become considerably more attuned to noticing over the preceding 8 months than I had been at any earlier point in our 50-year relationship as siblings. Frank and I flew out on one-way tickets roughly 6 months after that initial scouting trip, 65 and 68 years old respectively, toward a life we could not have fully imagined for ourselves even a single year earlier, carrying with us both the accumulated exhaustion of 12 years of caregiving and a fresh, considerable wound regarding Gary's treatment of everything that caregiving had actually cost me. The small house we arranged, modest but comfortable, sat in a quieter residential area of the island, away from the more heavily touristed stretches of beach, but still within easy walking distance of the water itself. A local property manager named Bea, who had helped us secure the rental remotely before our arrival, met us at the boat terminal with genuine warmth, helping us settle in over those first several days of building an entirely unfamiliar daily existence. I want to be honest that the first several months were not entirely without their own difficulties. The particular disorientation of rebuilding an entire retirement at 65 years old, still processing both grief for my mother and the fresh wound Gary's accusation had opened. in a place where we knew almost no one beyond the handful of retirees we'd briefly met during our scouting trip. There were mornings I woke in that unfamiliar bedroom and simply lay there, uncertain whether the peace I genuinely felt during our brief visit would actually sustain itself once the daily realities of an entirely new life set in. I remember, in particular, a difficult evening about 6 weeks in, when Frank was out walking, and I found myself alone in our new house for the first time since arriving, surrounded by boxes we still hadn't fully unpacked, and the particular silence of that unfamiliar room brought back, with unexpected force, the memory of my mother's own bedroom back in Oregon, empty in almost exactly the same way after her death. I sat with that grief more fully that evening than I had allowed myself to during the entire busy process of selling our house and arranging the move, finally letting myself simply feel the loss of her, without the accompanying anger toward Gary that had, I realized, been quietly absorbing most of my emotional attention for the better part of a year. What began to change things gradually was Bea's introduction, about 2 months in, to a small community garden project not far from our house, run by local women growing vegetables collectively to supplement their families' incomes, several of whom, Bea mentioned, were themselves caring for aging parents or in-laws within their own multi-generational households, a circumstance that struck me the very first time I heard it described, with a particular recognition given everything I had spent the previous 12 years navigating myself. There was one woman in particular, a warm, practical woman named Divina, roughly my own age, who was currently in her 4th year caring for her own elderly mother-in-law within her household, and who approached our very first conversation with an ease and genuine curiosity that made sharing my own 12 years and everything that had happened afterward with Gary feel considerably less like reopening a wound and more like finally setting down something I had been carrying entirely alone. Here, when one person carries the family's caregiving, she told me, the whole family is expected to acknowledge that debt, not question it. What your brother did, that would shame him here, not you. Divina and I fell over the following months into an easy rhythm of shared understanding that I hadn't fully experienced even with Patricia, who, however loving, had never actually lived inside the daily mechanics of caregiving the way both Divina and I had. We traded practical advice, the specific tricks for managing difficult medication schedules, the particular exhaustion of interrupted sleep, and I found in her company a validation I had waited 12 years to receive from my own siblings and had, instead, finally found in a woman I'd known only a matter of months. I remember one particular afternoon, working alongside Divina in the garden, when she asked me directly whether I had ever considered simply telling Gary, plainly and without diplomacy, exactly how much his comment had actually cost me, rather than allowing the relationship to simply fade into distant politeness. I told her I had considered it many times and that some part of me suspected he already understood, at least partially, without needing me to spell it out further. Understanding partially and understanding fully are different things, she told me. Sometimes the people who love us need to hear the whole weight of it stated plainly, or they will spend their whole lives believing the smaller version was enough. I have thought about that particular exchange often since, uncertain whether I will ever actually follow her advice, but grateful, regardless, for a friend willing to gently push me toward a conversation I had otherwise been quietly avoiding. I began volunteering regularly with that garden project, contributing what modest expertise I had from decades of maintaining my own household gardens back in Oregon, and found myself within a few months genuinely looking forward to those mornings with an eagerness I hadn't expected to feel again so soon after everything that had happened. About 7 months into our time on the island, Frank had a minor cardiac episode that tested, in a very concrete way, whether the healthcare infrastructure we'd researched so carefully would actually hold up under real pressure. We got him to the mainland hospital within the hour, and the cardiac specialist there, thoroughly credentialed and genuinely attentive, stabilized him quickly, confirming it had been a manageable arrhythmia rather than anything more serious, though he remained under observation for 2 full days as a precaution. Divina and several other women from the garden project visited that hospital repeatedly during Frank's stay, bringing food, sitting with me through the longer stretches of waiting, and I remember thinking, sitting beside Frank's hospital bed surrounded by women who had known us for less than a year, about that meeting in our family attorney's office, about a brother who had questioned 12 years of my own integrity in front of a stranger set against near strangers here who simply immediately showed up without a second thought. The contrast was not something I could easily set aside. I remember in particular the second night of Frank's observation stay, sitting alone in the quiet hospital room while he slept, and Divina appearing at nearly 10 in the evening, having heard from another woman in our garden group that I hadn't left the hospital all day. She brought a simple meal, insisted I actually eat rather than continuing to subsist on vending machine coffee, and sat with me for nearly an hour, mostly in comfortable silence, simply so I wouldn't be entirely alone with my own worry. When I thanked her, somewhat overwhelmed by the gesture, she waved it off entirely. "This is only what people do for each other," she said, as though I had thanked her for something considerably smaller than what it actually felt like in that moment. Frank recovered fully within a few weeks, the specialist adjusting his medication slightly and clearing him for the same active beach walking mornings he'd come to genuinely treasure since our arrival. The entire episode, frightening as it was in the moment, ultimately reinforced something I had already begun to suspect about the life we were building here, that the actual measure of a community isn't how long you've known its members, but how immediately and completely they show up once you actually need them. Patricia came to visit us about 10 months into our time on the island, her first opportunity to see the actual life we had built rather than hear about it through increasingly warm but still secondhand phone calls. She landed genuinely delighted rather than worried, having remained supportive throughout the entire process, and I showed her everything, the garden project, where Divina greeted her warmly, the beach itself, which left her, by her own admission, more relaxed within 48 hours than she'd felt in years back in California. On her second evening, walking along White Beach as the sun set, Patricia asked me carefully whether I had truly made peace with how things had ended with Gary, or whether I was simply avoiding the discomfort of continuing to confront it. I told her honestly that I wasn't certain those two things were as different as she was suggesting, that sometimes putting real distance between yourself and a wound is itself a legitimate form of making peace with it, rather than merely postponing a reckoning that might never actually arrive in any form either of us would find satisfying. The moment that moved her most happened on her fourth day, sitting with me on our small porch as the sun set over the water, when she finally said something she had clearly been considering saying for the better part of the visit. "I should have said something in that attorney's office, Diane. I've regretted my silence every day since." I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her saying so now, and that I understood in the moment The shock of Gary's comment had likely rendered her nearly as speechless as it had rendered me. She has, in the time since that visit, become considerably more willing to directly challenge Gary whenever the subject resurfaces between them, a small but genuine shift I have come to value enormously. Gary, I want to be honest, has not visited, and our relationship remains, as of this recording, considerably more distant than I would ever have chosen for myself. An occasional brief phone call around holidays, nothing resembling genuine reconciliation. I do not know whether that relationship will ever recover the closeness we once shared before any of this happened, and I have made a difficult peace over these past 2 years with the real possibility that it may not, at least not until he is willing to genuinely reckon with what his single comment in that attorney's office actually cost both our relationship and my own sense of having been trusted by my own family. I have thought often about what I might actually say to him if he ever did reach out with genuine willingness to discuss what happened. I do not believe I want an elaborate apology or any grand gesture attempting to make up for 12 years of disparity between our respective contributions. I think what I would actually want, if I'm honest, is simply for him to say plainly that he understands now what those years cost me, and that his suspicion, however briefly held, was genuinely unfair given everything I had already given without complaint or expectation of specific recognition. Whether that particular conversation ever actually happens remains, as of this recording, an open question I have largely stopped waiting anxiously for the answer to. I am 66 years old now, having given 12 years of my own working life to caring for my mother, only to have that sacrifice questioned by my own brother in the most painful way I could have imagined. Our monthly expenses here, rent on the modest house, food, the occasional supplies for the garden project, come to somewhere around 90,000 pesos, combined for both Frank and myself, just under $1,600, comfortably covered by our combined Social Security and the modest portion of my mother's estate that remained after everything settled, with considerably more breathing room than either of us had anticipated, given how thoroughly that final year in Oregon had drained us both financially and emotionally. We have, in the 2 years since arriving, settled into a genuinely comfortable daily rhythm neither of us anticipated quite so fully during those first uncertain weeks. Frank has taken up a modest woodworking hobby, building small furniture pieces for our own house and occasionally for neighbors who admire his work, a pursuit that has done more for his general spirits, I believe, than any medication his cardiologist has prescribed. I split my own time between the garden project and simply enjoying the specific, unhurried pace of island life, mornings on the beach before the day's heat fully sets in, afternoons that no longer require managing anyone's medication schedule but my own. I think often about that meeting in the attorney's office, about the specific, particular cruelty of having your own integrity questioned by someone who contributed a fraction of what you gave in front of a stranger who had no reason to doubt me beyond my own brother's suggestion that he should. But I have learned at an age when most people assume every major lesson of their life is already behind them, that being wrongly suspected does not actually diminish what you genuinely gave, regardless of who ultimately fails to fully acknowledge it. I have found on an island I had never once considered before betrayal made Oregon considerably harder to keep calling home. A community of women who understood exactly what 12 years of unacknowledged caregiving actually costs, without ever once needing me to produce 12 years of receipts to prove it to them. If there is one thing I would want another caregiver watching this, sitting somewhere right now, wondering whether their own sacrifice will ever be genuinely seen by the people who benefited from it, to understand it is this: you are allowed to grieve being doubted by the very people your sacrifice protected. And you are also allowed at the very same time to go looking for somewhere new where that specific kind of doubt simply isn't the currency people trade in. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like mine, and I believe you will find them worth your time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next.